A black executive steps onto a first-class flight, ready to return home after closing a multi-million-dollar deal. But the moment he takes his seat, everything changes. A racist passenger complains, demanding that he be moved because this isn't the right section for people like him. The flight crew's response? At first, it's tense. Eyes dart. A flight attendant hesitates. Then, just 7 minutes later, the plane's captain steps in. What happens next stuns everyone, and sets off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, comment below and let us know where you're watching from. If you find this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories that challenge the way we see the world. It all started on what should have been just another routine flight. The airport was a place of transitions, where people moved in and out of spaces that did not belong to them. Spaces they only occupied for as long as their tickets allowed. It was a place of order and routine, a system designed to keep people moving. Some quickly, others deliberately slowed by obstacles unseen and unspoken. Nathaniel Pierce had always understood how the world worked. He understood it as a child, when he watched his father tip his hat and step aside on the sidewalk for men who never acknowledged him. He understood it when his mother taught him the importance of speaking properly, of never letting his voice rise too much, of knowing when to lower his eyes. And he understood it now, as he walked through the gleaming terminal of Atlanta International Airport, heading toward Gate C-14. He had just returned from deployment, the weight of a duffel bag pressing against his shoulder, his uniform crisp despite the exhaustion pressing at the edges of his mind. He had spent the last 14 months in places where the ground burned under the weight of the sun, where every second was a calculation between survival and duty. And now, finally, he was home. But home, as Nathaniel knew, was never quite as simple as stepping off a plane. As he moved through the terminal, he saw the looks before he felt them. The subtle shift in body language, the stiffness in postures, the slight but unmistakable hesitations in the glances of the people he passed. Some of them were fleeting, a reflex, unconscious even. Others lingered. He understood what they saw. A black man in uniform, his boots still dusty from foreign soil, standing tall in a space where people like him were expected to be grateful, not entitled. He had seen it before. He would see it again. At the gate, a mother pulled her young daughter closer as he walked by. A businessman with graying hair and a navy blue suit eyed him with vague curiosity before returning to his phone. A woman in pearl earrings clutched her handbag just a little tighter. Nathaniel exhaled. None of this was new. He stepped toward the counter, his boarding pass in hand, and offered it to the gate agent, a young woman with a practiced smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Pierce," she said, scanning his ticket. "First class is to your left." The words had barely left her lips when a voice cut through the air. "Excuse me?" Nathaniel turned his head slightly, already knowing what was coming. The businessman, the same one who had been scrolling through his phone moments ago, stood just a few feet away. His tone was carefully controlled, but there was an edge to it, a tightness around the corners of his mouth. "I think there's been a mistake," the man continued, addressing the gate agent. "I was under the impression that first-class seating was limited." Nathaniel felt his jaw tighten. He shifted his weight slightly, adjusting the strap of his bag. The gate agent hesitated, her professional demeanor faltering just slightly. "Sir, Mr. Pierce is assigned to first class. There's no mistake." The businessman blinked, the corners of his mouth twitching as if he was deciding whether or not to push further. Nathaniel waited. It was always the waiting that was hardest. Waiting to see whether this would be the kind of encounter that ended with an uneasy silence or whether it would be the kind that required patience, restraint, the kind that required him to prove, to perform, his right to exist in a space that should not have to be justified. The businessman exhaled sharply, his lips pressing together. Finally, after what felt like minutes, he turned without another word and walked toward the jet bridge. The gate agent avoided Nathaniel's gaze as she handed him his ticket back. "Have a good flight, Mr. Pierce." Nathaniel took the ticket, nodded, and stepped forward. Inside, the air felt colder, The walls of the jet bridge seemed to close in as he walked toward the plane. The weight of something unseen settling over him. He had faced enemies before. He had been trained for battle. For uncertainty. For the kind of danger that could be seen. Could be named. But this was different. This was the kind of war fought in silence. In the space between words. In the small but deliberate ways a man could be told that he was somewhere he did not belong. And the flight hadn't even taken off yet. Nathaniel Pierce had taken his seat in 2A, by the window. Where he could watch the world shrink below him once the plane took off. He liked windows. They made it easier to focus on something else. Something beyond the space he occupied. He placed his duffel bag in the overhead bin. Careful to keep his movements controlled. Deliberate. He had learned, over time, that there was a way to exist in spaces like this. A way to be seen without making people too aware of your presence. He was good at it now. The businessman who had questioned his seat at the gate had taken 2C. The aisle seat beside him. Nathaniel could feel the tension in the space between them. It was a small thing. The way the man angled his body slightly away. The way his arm remained close to his side. Not quite touching the armrest they shared. It was a small thing. But small things like this had a way of growing. Of becoming something heavier. The first-class cabin filled quickly. A flight attendant, a blonde woman with a stiff smile, made her way down the aisle, offering pre-flight drinks. "Can I get you something, sir?" she asked the businessman first. "Scotch," he replied, his tone clipped. "And for you?" she asked Nathaniel. "Just water, thanks." She nodded but did not meet his eyes. Nathaniel had barely settled into his seat when he heard it. A voice, just behind him. "Excuse me, miss," a woman said, the sharp edge of entitlement woven into every syllable. "There must be a mistake. I paid for a first-class seat. And I'd like to be seated next to someone I'm comfortable with." Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment before turning slightly. The woman was older, perhaps in her 60s. With silver-streaked hair in a tight bun and pearl earrings that caught the cabin lights. She sat in 3C, just behind him. Her expression was carefully arranged into something polite, but the stiffness in her mouth betrayed her. The flight attendant hesitated. "Ma'am, all passengers in first class are seated according to their assigned tickets." "I understand," the woman said, keeping her voice light, "but surely there's some kind of arrangement that can be made. She glanced at Nathaniel. Her lips pressing together. "I just wasn't expecting this." Nathaniel felt the words settle over him like heat rising from asphalt. "I wasn't expecting this." He had been here before. Many times. He had been unexpected at restaurants. At department stores. At high-rise office buildings where security guards asked for identification that no one else seemed to need. He had been unexpected at interviews where the employer's smile tightened upon shaking his hand. Where their eyes darted quickly to his resume. As if to verify, again, that he was the same man they had invited. He had been unexpected in boardrooms. In hotel lobbies. In neighborhoods where people asked, "Can I help you?" when what they meant was, "Why are you here?" And now, here he was again, unexpected in first class. Nathaniel said nothing. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the flight attendant said, shifting her weight slightly, "but there are no other seats available." The woman exhaled, her nostrils flaring slightly. "Fine," she muttered, shifting in her seat, but her body language had already spoken louder than any words could. Nathaniel turned back toward the window. The businessman beside him was silent, but Nathaniel could feel him listening, could sense his amusement, the kind of amusement that wasn't kind. The kind that said, "See? It's not just me." A few rows back, someone cleared their throat. "Some people should really be more grateful." A voice muttered. Nathaniel let out a slow breath. He had spent months overseas in places where the air was thick with danger. Where his uniform had been the only thing that mattered. It was strange, now, to return to a place where that same uniform, the one that had protected him there, could not protect him here. The engines rumbled beneath them as the plane prepared for takeoff. Nathaniel kept his gaze fixed on the window, watching the tarmac blur past. He was going home. But home, he was reminded, was never as simple as getting on a plane. Nathaniel Pierce kept his eyes on the window as the plane lifted from the runway. Watching the ground shrink beneath him, there was a strange comfort in this moment. In the feeling of being untethered, of rising above everything. Up here, it didn't matter where you came from or what expectations people placed on you. Everyone was just another body in a seat. Just another traveler waiting to land. But even here, the rules were different. He had learned them young. And had spent years memorizing them. Rule number 1. Move carefully. Don't take up too much space. Rule number 2. Keep your voice measured. A calm tone is your best defense. Rule number 3. If they expect you to fight, disappoint them. If they expect you to bow, disappoint them even more. These rules had carried him through small towns and big cities. Through school hallways and military barracks. Through boardrooms and airports. They had shaped him into someone who knew how to navigate places that weren't built for him. Someone who had learned how to exist in the spaces where people weren't expecting him. The rules had kept him safe. But safety was not the same as dignity. Nathaniel inhaled slowly, steadying his breath as he leaned back into the seat. He could still feel the weight of the woman's words behind him. Still hear the clipped murmur of passengers exchanging glances they thought he wouldn't notice. The flight attendant, Emma, according to her name tag, returned with their drinks, her movements precise and practiced. "Here you are, sir," she said, setting down the businessman's scotch before turning to Nathaniel. "And your water." He nodded in thanks, taking the glass with careful hands. "I hope you're comfortable," Emma said, her voice low. There was something there, an apology, perhaps, a quiet acknowledgement. Nathaniel studied her for a second. She looked like the kind of woman who knew how to keep things moving. How to smooth over tension with a well-placed smile. But there was something behind her eyes now. Something careful. "I'm fine," he said evenly. She hesitated just a fraction of a second before nodding and moving on. Nathaniel turned back to his window. The businessman beside him cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "Hell of a world we live in." "Huh?" the man muttered. Nathaniel kept his face neutral. "What do you mean?" The man let out a dry chuckle, swirling his drink. "You know what I mean." Nathaniel exhaled slowly. Rule number 4. Make them say it. He let the silence stretch. The businessman shrugged, taking a sip of his scotch. "People just get so sensitive these days," he continued, always looking for something to be offended by. Nathaniel took a sip of his water, his grip tightening slightly around the glass. "Maybe," he said, keeping his voice even, "or maybe some things just don't sit right anymore." The businessman smirked, shifting in his seat. "I guess you'd know about that." "Huh?" Nathaniel didn't take the bait. He had learned long ago that these conversations were never really conversations. They were tests, prodding, pushing, waiting for a reaction they could mold into something else. "You work for the airlines?" the businessman asked, changing the subject abruptly. Nathaniel blinked, caught off guard by the question. "No." "Oh," the man said, raising an eyebrow. "I just figured." "Well, you're dressed pretty casual for first class." Nathaniel let the words settle between them. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even subtle. "Do you fly often?" Nathaniel asked instead. The businessman's smirk widened, as if he'd won something. "Twice a month. Senior management. I make sure to treat myself when I travel." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "Must be nice." The businessman chuckled, tipping his glass slightly. "You know, I believe in earning things. Hard work. Dedication. None of this handout nonsense. If you want a seat in first class, you pay for it. You know what I mean?" Nathaniel felt the words hit him like a second-hand slap. The businessman was daring him to push back. Daring him to get angry. Nathaniel took another sip of water and smiled slightly. "Good thing I paid for my seat." Then, the man's expression flickered. Just for a second, Nathaniel held his gaze, letting the silence stretch again. Rule number 5. Don't let them see what it costs you. Emma passed by again, her gaze flicking toward Nathaniel briefly before settling back into her professional mask. The businessman shifted again, suddenly interested in his phone. Nathaniel turned back to the window. Outside, the sky stretched wide and open, the horizon a perfect line against the clouds. But even here, miles above the world. The weight of it all still followed. And the rules were still the same. Nathaniel sat still, his fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. The cabin hummed with the sounds of a flight in progress. Muted conversations, the low drone of the engines, the occasional clink of ice against a glass. The businessman beside him, Richard Walsh, according to the name on his laptop screen, has gone quiet. Maybe he had decided that whatever silent game he was playing wasn't worth the effort. Maybe he was stewing in his own self-righteousness. Recalibrating, looking for another way to frame the moment in his favor. Nathaniel had seen it before. The way discomfort turned into resentment. How the simple act of existing in a space he was not expected to occupy made people itch under their tailored suits. Because that's what this was. A fundamental question, one people like Richard never had to ask themselves. Do I belong here? For Nathaniel, it had never been rhetorical. He exhaled quietly, stretching his legs just enough to test the invisible boundary between himself and the man beside him. Richard's body tensed ever so slightly. It was a movement so small that anyone else might have missed it. But Nathaniel didn't miss things like that. Neither did Emma. The flight attendant moved through the cabin, offering refills and light conversation to the first-class passengers. When she reached Nathaniel and Richard's row, her gaze lingered for just a fraction of a second. Another drink, sir? She asked Richard. He nodded without looking at her, his eyes still glued to his laptop. Scotch. Neat. Emma turned to Nathaniel. And for you, sir? I'm good, thanks. She hesitated, her professional smile never faltering. But he saw it, the same quiet calculation he had seen in her eyes earlier. She knew. Emma moved on, and Nathaniel adjusted his seat, rolling his shoulders. The cabin had settled into a lull. But the air still felt thick with something unspoken. It always did. Then it happened. A voice, sharp, irritated, loud enough to carry. Excuse me. Nathaniel turned his head slightly, catching sight of the woman a few rows behind them. She was well dressed, older, with pearl earrings that gleamed under the cabin lights. I need to change seats, she said, directing her words at Emma, who had paused mid-step. I'm not comfortable sitting next to. Quote. She stopped short, as if reconsidering how much to reveal in front of an audience. The man beside her, white, mid-50s, reading the Wall Street Journal, shifted uncomfortably, not uncomfortable enough to intervene, but just enough to signal that he wanted no part in what was unfolding. Nathaniel didn't move, he didn't react, he waited. Emma, to her credit, did not flinch. I'm sorry, ma'am, she said, her voice smooth and steady. But we are fully booked in first class today. The woman let out a tight, incredulous laugh. Surely there must be something you can do. Emma remained unmoved. I can look for an available seat in economy. If that would be preferable. The woman's face darkened. I paid for the first class. Nathaniel could feel the shift around him. The passengers who were suddenly pretending not to listen. The flight attendants who kept moving but were watching now. Richard sighed beside him, shaking his head slightly, but said nothing. Nathaniel looked up at Emma then. And for the first time, their gazes met for real. She was tired. Not from the job, not from the hours on her feet or the endless cycle of customer service pleasantries. No, this was something else. This was the exhaustion of a woman who had played referee in these unspoken battles too many times before. Nathaniel exhaled through his nose. He was already tired of it, too. And he hadn't even said a word. The woman's voice cut through the silence again. I shouldn't have to explain why I'm uncomfortable. Nathaniel leaned back in his seat. There it was. Not explicit, but loud enough. Not a slur, but sharp enough to leave a mark. The words might as well have been written across the cabin walls. Some people belong here, some people don't. Nathaniel had a choice to make. He could let Emma handle it. Let her go through the carefully curated playbook of neutrality, professionalism, and customer service diplomacy. Or he could break rule number 3. If they expect you to bow, disappoint them. He turned fully in his seat now, looking over at the woman as if he had only just realized she was speaking. Ma'am, he said, his voice measured, his expression unreadable. Is there something wrong? Her lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't about you," she said stiffly. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. "Seems like it is." The woman's jaw tightened. The Wall Street Journal man beside her finally cleared his throat, shifting his weight, still not willing to challenge her, just uncomfortable enough to want the conversation to end. Emma straightened. "Sir, you are under no obligation to." Quote. Nathaniel lifted a hand slightly, silencing her, not unkindly, just enough to let her know that he would handle it. His mother's voice echoed in the back of his mind. "Pick your battles, Nathaniel, but don't ever let them pick you apart." He turned back to the woman. "You're uncomfortable," he repeated, as if testing the words. "And you need to change seats?" She hesitated. She hadn't expected him to address her directly. By all means." Nathaniel gestured to the aisle, his voice pleasant, but firm. "Don't let me stop you." A beat of silence. The woman's fingers clenched against the armrest. She was losing. Nathaniel didn't look away. He continued smoothly, "You can sit right where you are and mind your business. Like I've been doing since this flight started." Emma was watching now. So was everyone else. The woman's face was tight with barely concealed anger. For a second, Nathaniel thought she might actually take the offer. Might actually stand up, grab her designer handbag, and storm to the back of the plane where she would have to sit in economy. But she didn't. She exhaled sharply through her nose, turned her head toward the window, and muttered, "Forget it." Nathaniel let the silence settle for a moment longer before turning back in his seat. Emma met his gaze one last time before nodding slightly. And then, just like that, the moment passed. But Nathaniel knew better. It would never be just a moment. Because these moments stacked on top of each other, folding into the weight of every other time. Every raised eyebrow, every doubt, every unspoken rule. The flight continued. The sky stretched on, infinite and blue. And Nathaniel sat still. In the seat he had paid for. In the space he had every right to exist in. And that, more than anything, was what they couldn't stand. Nathaniel sat motionless in his seat, his fingers still resting lightly on the armrest, his mind processing the confrontation that had just unfolded. The woman behind him, tight-lipped, pearl-clad, and seething, had let the moment pass. But Nathaniel knew better. Nothing ever really passed. These moments did not dissolve into thin air. They lived on, absorbed into the skin, the memory of them settling in the body like second-hand smoke. The plane cruised forward, but the weight of the exchange still hung in the air. He could feel it in the stiff posture of the businessman beside him. Richard Walsh, who had spent the last 20 minutes trying and failing to pretend that he was not listening. He could hear it in the silence that followed. The unspoken tension of passengers who had witnessed something they would later whisper about, but never fully name. The rules had been broken. Not the ones printed in airline policy manuals. Not the ones the flight attendants recited over the intercom. The other rules. The unwritten ones. Nathaniel had spoken when he wasn't supposed to. He had refused to shrink. And that, more than anything, was the real offense. Emma returned, her posture composed, but her movements a little sharper. A little more careful than before. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice neutral. Nathaniel glanced up, but not at her. He was watching Richard now. "I'm fine," he said. Richard shifted beside him, his hand tightening around the glass of scotch the flight attendant had placed there earlier. Nathaniel could almost hear the internal war happening in the man's mind. The debate, the quiet, simmering outrage, the realization that something had shifted in the carefully controlled world of first-class exclusivity. And he could feel what was coming. Because it always came. Richard turned slightly, the movement small, calculated. "You didn't have to make a scene," he muttered. Nathaniel let the words settle for a moment before responding. "A scene?" Richard exhaled sharply. "You could have just let the flight attendant handle it. No need to escalate." Nathaniel smiled, slow and tired. "I see. And when exactly did I escalate?" Richard gestured vaguely. "You could have just ignored her." Nathaniel let out a short breath. Almost a laugh. "Ignored her," he repeated. Richard frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "Look," he sighed, setting his glass down. "I get it. You wanted to prove a point. But what's the use? People like her don't change. It's just how things are. Nathaniel nodded slowly, as if considering the statement. How things are, he echoed. The weight of those words sat between them. The businessman reached for his scotch again. Staring straight ahead, he thought the conversation was over. Nathaniel let him believe it. For a moment. Then, finally, he leaned in slightly, his voice lower now, steady, but pointed. I wonder, he said, if someone ever told you that. Richard turned to look at him now. Confusion flickering across his face. Told me what? That it's just how things are. Nathaniel's voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen. He didn't have to. I wonder, he continued, if anyone ever looked at you. Before you had your suit. Before your title. Before you sat in seats like this. And told you that there were places you couldn't go. Rooms you couldn't enter. That no matter what you did. What you achieved. It wouldn't change a thing. Richard's jaw tightened. That's different. Is it? Nathaniel watched the man's grip tighten around his drink. Because he knew exactly what kind of man Richard was. Knew exactly what it had taken for him to climb. To carve out space in the world. Knew exactly what he had sacrificed to be here. But there was a difference. Nathaniel had spent his whole life being told that even after climbing, after struggling, after proving and proving and proving, it still would not be enough. And Richard? Richard had spent his whole life believing that it should be. The businessman's mouth opened, then closed again, as if the words were there, but refusing to form. Nathaniel didn't wait for him to find them. Instead, he turned back to the window, resting his head against the seat. He had nothing left to prove. Not to Richard, not to the woman behind him, not to anyone on this plane. And yet, as the flight continued, he could feel it, the shifting weight of unspoken rules. The battle that would outlast this flight. This moment, this lifetime. And the truth was, he wasn't tired because he fought. He was tired because he always had to. The plane hummed with the low murmur of passengers settling into their seats. The clinking of glasses, the rustle of newspapers, a return to normalcy, or at least, the illusion of it. Nathaniel felt the shift, the way the air had changed. He had spent a lifetime recognizing this moment. The moment after the confrontation, after the unspoken battle lines had been drawn. After people convinced themselves that the world had not just revealed something ugly about itself. It was in the way Richard sat stiffly beside him, his posture betraying the turmoil beneath his otherwise polished exterior. It was in the way the flight attendant, Emma, avoided looking at him too long, guilt flickering behind her professionalism. It was in the occasional glances from other passengers, some approving, others wary, a few disapproving, but none neutral, because neutrality never existed in moments like these. And Nathaniel knew it. The turbulence started subtly at first. A small shudder in the air. A reminder that even metal and engineering could not escape the will of the sky. Nathaniel watched the ice shift in Richard's untouched drink. The liquid trembling against the glass. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a bit of rough air ahead. Nothing to worry about, but please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. The captain's voice was calm, measured, the way authority always was when it wanted people to obey. Nathaniel exhaled. He had been here before. Not in first class. Not at 35,000 feet. But here, in the space between comfort and confrontation. In the moments where everything is supposed to return to order but instead, the cracks only grow deeper. It was never the initial moment of racism that cut the deepest. It was what happened after. The moment when the people who could speak, who should speak, chose instead to turn the page. Choose instead to sip their drinks. Choose instead to lower their eyes. It was the silence. That's what stuck. That's what burned. The turbulence grew stronger, rattling the glasses, making the overhead compartments shudder. Richard flinched beside him, gripping the armrest slightly tighter. Nathaniel didn't move. He had grown accustomed to turbulence. In the air, on the ground, in life. He turned his head slightly. His voice so soft, it barely carried over the noise. You still think I made a scene? Richard's eyes darted toward him. Then away. The man did not answer. But Nathaniel saw the answer all the same. Yes. Because for men like Richard, silence was survival. Because for men like Richard, the world had always rewarded those who played by the rules. Because for men like Richard, speaking out was always an option, never a necessity. Nathaniel had no such luxury. He had never been given the option of silence. He had never been granted the illusion that his place in the world was secure. He had learned, from the moment he understood what it meant to be a black man in America, that silence was not a refuge. Silence was a coffin, and he refused to be buried. The plane jolted again, a sharp drop, and a few passengers gasped. Nathaniel barely noticed. His focus was on Richard. Because at that moment, he recognized something. Beneath the carefully constructed shell of corporate politeness, beneath the privilege and the performance, Richard wasn't just angry. He was scared. Scared in a way that had nothing to do with the plane, and everything to do with the realization that he was losing control. Losing control of the rules. Losing control of the spaces that had always catered to him. Losing control of a world that had, until now, always bent in his favor. And Nathaniel felt a strange, unexpected thing. Pity. Because nothing terrified a man like Richard more than realizing that the world did not belong to him. The turbulence smoothed. The flight attendants resumed their duties, and first class returned to its quiet, expensive hum. But Nathaniel knew better, because the real turbulence had only just begun. The cabin had settled, at least on the surface. Drinks had been refreshed, flight attendants moved with their quiet efficiency, and the dull hum of conversation had resumed among the passengers. But nothing had returned to normal. Nathaniel could feel it in the air, the way eyes flickered toward him, then away, the way Richard sat rigid beside him, feigning interest in the untouched report in his lap, the way Emma, the flight attendant, smiled a little too tightly, her hands just a little too careful when setting down a drink. It was the weight of unspoken things. And Nathaniel had spent a lifetime navigating them. He had watched it happen before. In boardrooms, in classrooms, in the quiet corners of polite society where racism did not wear hoods or carry torches, but instead draped itself in civility. A moment like this small, quiet confrontation, had already begun to ripple outward. The other passengers had felt it. Some had been waiting for it to pass, to be forgotten, because it is always easier to pretend that the world has not just unmasked itself. Others had watched with something like satisfaction, perhaps because it confirmed what they already believed, or perhaps because they had been waiting for proof that their silence had been justified. But then, there were the others, the ones who had shifted in their seats, their hands tightening around their glasses, their brows creasing as if they were suddenly seeing the world with new eyes. The ones who were starting to question. And that was dangerous. Not for Nathaniel, but for Richard, because men like Richard thrived on certainty. And certainty was slipping from his grasp. Nathaniel felt the shift before it happened. Richard exhaled sharply beside him. Not a sigh. A surrender. I suppose you think you won. Nathaniel turned his head slightly, the corners of his lips tilting up. Won? He echoed. What exactly do you think I've won? Richard hesitated. And that, more than anything, told Nathaniel the truth. This wasn't just about a seat. This wasn't just about him. This was about Richard's fear. Of a world that was changing. Of the people who no longer stayed silent. Of the fact that power, his power, was no longer unquestioned. You're just. Richard gestured vaguely. His throat worked around the words, struggling to find something that wouldn't betray him. That wouldn't make it too obvious. You're making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be. Nathaniel let out a soft chuckle. You think I'm the one who made it a big deal? Richard's jaw clenched. Look, I didn't mean, quote. Yes, you did. A pause. The cabin buzzed around them. Conversations and quiet laughter filling the space. But at their row, the air was sharp. Nathaniel turned fully now, his voice still low, calm, steady. Let me ask you something. Richard, if I had been white, would you have asked to move seats? Richard didn't answer, because what was there to say? The silence between them spoke louder than any confession ever could. Nathaniel had seen that silence before, too. It was the silence of a man realizing, for the first time, That his world had been built on something more fragile than he'd ever dared to believe. And it was cracking. The flight attendant passed by again. Her tray balanced with careful precision. Richard reached for his drink. His fingers closing around the glass. I don't see why we have to make everything about race, he muttered. Nathaniel exhaled through his nose. And yet, somehow, you always do. Richard flinched. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not just anger, but something else. Recognition. Nathaniel didn't press further. He didn't need to. Because the worst thing for a man like Richard wasn't being called out. It was being forced to see himself clearly. And the truth was already sinking in. The seatbelt sign flickered on as the captain's voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent into Chicago shortly. Flight attendants, please prepare for landing. The final stretch. Nathaniel settled back into his seat, folding his hands over his lap. Richard still hadn't looked at him. His shoulders were tight, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed out the window as if he could escape into the clouds. But Nathaniel knew better. There was no escape from the truth. Not at 35,000 feet. And certainly not on the ground. The seatbelt sign flickered on. And the cabin hushed as the plane began its slow descent into Chicago. Outside the window, the city stretched wide and glittering beneath the fading light. But inside the plane, a different descent was taking place. A descent into reckoning. Richard had not spoken again. Not a single word since Nathaniel's quiet challenge had left him sitting in the ruin of his own certainty. He had spent the last 20 minutes staring at nothing. His fingers tapping absently on the armrest. His breathing just slightly too fast. Nathaniel had seen this before. The unraveling. The moment when a man, a certain kind of man, begins to realize that the world he has built for himself, the world he has always assumed was his by right, is not what he thought it was. It was happening to Richard now. And it was quiet. Not loud. Not violent. Not the kind of collapse that draws attention. Just a slow, creeping awareness. A man drowning, but too proud to reach for the surface. Passengers stirred around them, gathering their belongings, checking their phones, stretching their stiffened limbs. Nathaniel remained still. Not out of caution. Not out of fear. But because he had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful thing a black man could do was simply remain. Refuse to move. Refuse to be erased. His presence alone was the challenge. And Richard was feeling it. He could see it in the way Richard's fingers tightened around the armrest. In the way his lips pressed thin. In the way his eyes flickered. Hesitant. Searching. Lost. As if he was trying to find a way back. As if he was realizing. Too late. That there was no way back. Only forward. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thud. Shaking the cabin. Nathaniel felt the weight of the descent press against his chest. A reminder that they were nearly on the ground. He glanced toward Richard once more. Not expecting anything. But something happened. Richard turned. Just slightly. Just enough that their eyes met. For the first time since the beginning of this flight. Richard looked at him. Really looked at him. And Nathaniel saw it. The thing Richard had been fighting this whole time. It wasn't anger. It wasn't defiance. It was shame. Not the kind that lashes out. Not the kind that seeks to justify itself. Not the kind that turns into rage. But the quiet, unfamiliar, humbling kind. The kind that lingers. The kind that changes a man. The kind that forces him to see. Nathaniel did not break the silence between them. He did not move to make Richard feel better. He did not extend the mercy that Richard might have expected. Because this was not about Richard's comfort. It never had been. The plane touched down. Passengers exhaled, stretching, shifting in their seats. The tension that had filled the cabin seemed to release with the wheels skimming the earth. But Richard did not move. He sat there, gripping his armrest, staring straight ahead, his entire body still. Nathaniel waited. Because he knew what was coming. A moment later, Richard swallowed and opened his mouth. Listen, Nathaniel raised a brow. Not with hostility. Not with impatience. Just with the simple expectation that whatever Richard said next had better be worth saying. Richard hesitated. Then, finally, I was wrong. It was barely above a whisper. almost lost in the sound of passengers unbuckling, in the shuffle of feet, in the flight attendants preparing for arrival. But Nathaniel heard it, and he nodded. Not in forgiveness, not in dismissal, not in reassurance, just in recognition, because that was enough. And then he turned forward again, because this was not his burden to carry. The doors opened, passengers filed out. Some still stole glances at Nathaniel as they passed. Curious, watchful, expectant, but he did not care. Because he knew that what mattered was not what had happened on this plane, but what would happen after it. What mattered was whether men like Richard, and the people who had witnessed his unraveling, would carry this moment with them, would let it settle into their bones, would let it shape their choices, or whether they would simply walk off this plane and return to their lives unchanged. That was not Nathaniel's burden. It never had been. He took his time standing, and took his time retrieving his bag. He did not rush, because there was nothing. That said, he had to move faster for the comfort of a world that had spent centuries telling men like him where they did and did not belong. He belonged here, and that, more than anything, was the point. Richard lingered as the last passengers trickled out. Nathaniel did not look back. He did not need to. Because what had needed to be said had already been spoken. And what had needed to be heard had already been understood. The story was over, but the lesson had only just begun. And that was enough.